you had a good year for football.
Yeah, really good. I used to be a big football fan, but I'm not too much into it anymore. I've moved around too much.
Right. So family-wise, what?
My wife here and I have twin daughters that live in Missouri. One's in Columbia and the other one's in Owensville, small town of Owensville.
Okay.
They're both in their early 50s now, so I feel like an old man. I am an old.
Okay, that's great. Well, hey, everybody. We are actually formally started now. John and I have just been sharing a little information about him, and now we're actually formally started. This is going to be a combination of a interview of John and I, just letting you guys get to know him, and he has a really cool presentation to give also. We've got Ikerd and Mark both helping us, as we say, behind the glass. And John, I'm sure Ikerd told you this, but they aren't real close geographically. Ikerd's in Pakistan, and Mark is in Bangladesh. So
I didn't know where they were. You can't tell people right next door these days.
Right. Well, no matter where we have guests from, we always have the world pretty covered because of having those two guys out there where they're at. And then usually one of our hosts is from somewhere in the States. So anyway, I'm in northern Colorado right now, north of Denver, about an hour, and pretty crummy day, sort of overcast, icy, 30, right above freezing, the temperature-wise. So anyway, not common for us. We actually don't get that many days that are like this. People think we do, but we really don't.
We've had a couple of nights well below zero, 6 and 7 degrees below zero here.
Wow. We've not yet had real cold this winter. So we have about 6 inches of snow sitting on the ground probably, but not real super cold. We've been, the mid-teens or so has been pretty much the lows. So anyway, for the audience, real quick, please ask some questions. And you can do that by two different ways, really. One, there is actually question box on the right hand of your screen, and you can just click on that and write in a question. And Mark and Ikerd will be looking at those. John, you and I don't have to worry about looking at those. They'll actually look for us, and then when they see something, they'll let us know, and then we'll get it answered. Or you can actually, there's a little place where you can raise your hand, and that means that at some point we'll unmute you and we'll let you just directly ask your question of John. So either one of those two ways work, and I'll remind you of that as we're going through this. We try to be very respectful of our speakers as well as our audience, and we go for about an hour. There will be a replay of this that will be done about 36 hours from now or so. And it'll be on our EAT community website, and you'll be able to access that. We usually get about 10 times as many people within the first week watching replays as we do watching live. And so that'll be out there for you. And that's about it logistically. Again, it'll be a combination of a interview and presentation format here. So either Mark or Ikerd, I'm not sure which one of the two of them, is just playing a bunch of info about John in the background, and you can just kind of gaze at that as we're talking. So John, we sort of ended our informal session by asking about your family, and you had commented that you felt a little old, that you had two almost 50-year-olds. Well, I have a 47-year-old, and then I have three others that are just down the line a little bit from there, and they're spread all over the country. One of them is in Southern California, one is in Oregon, and then two of them are still here in Colorado. And I have 7 grandkids. How about yourself? Do you have any grandkids?
One grandkid and 2 step-grandsons. One grandson, 2 step-grandsons, yeah.
Cool. And just a little more on a personal level, and outside of regenerative agriculture and the main topic we're going to talk about, what would you consider hobbies or things that you enjoy?
Well, I enjoy getting together with friends and playing my guitar. I'm not a musician. I'm more of somebody that just enjoys playing old time country music. I grew up out in the country. When I grew up, we didn't have electricity, running water, and that sort of stuff at home, and so we had plenty of time to learn to play an instrument. And then the entertainment was when we'd have a music party, and you'd put the gas lantern up on the piano, and people would bring different instruments, and we'd play music. So we learned to play guitar, strum along with country songs and singing, that sort of thing. So that's kind of been my hobby over the years. At various times, I've been into fishing and hunting and various other things like that. In my old age, I find sitting around strumming the guitar. Like to have a glass of wine once in a while and go out to a local winery with my buddies and play guitar. That's it.
Very cool. Do you find that you have as much finger acuity still? I've actually got lots of friends our age kind of that are guitarists and pianists and drummers, and they said, yeah, they can still play as well as they could when they were in their 20s.
Well, my advantage was I never could play very well, so you wouldn't notice the difference.
Well, one quick little story for me. Have you ever heard of an event called the Weezer Fiddle Festival?
No.
Weezer is a town on the border of Idaho near Boise, and I think, I'm not sure which city. I think Payette in Oregon, but the little town that it's in is called Weezer. And every year they have this fiddle festival for like 4 days, and it is a jam fest. I mean, literally, you walk from one group that's sitting and playing, and 20, 30 yards away, there's another group sitting and playing, and then another 30, 40 yards, another group just sitting and playing. And I'm not a player, but I love good music, and I can play a little on the guitar. I just would love to just go from group to group and sit in and maybe just strum a little bit. And then mainly just listen and learn from these just amazing fiddlers and drummers and guitarists and accordion players and harmonica players and tambourines, you name it. So, very cool.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your long-term historical interest in regenerative farming and ranching, and realizing we both know that word really wasn't used at all until not that long ago. But does this go all the way back to where you grew up? And tell us a little of that history.
Yeah. Well, it may have roots back there. But when I grew up, like I said, grew up on a small diversified farm in the days before we had electricity, running water, and that sort of thing. But in the late 40s, early 50s, then we were able to go from our highly diversified farm. We always milked a few cows to where we were able to put in a grade A dairy on our farm. Was a small farm. We milked 20, 25 cows. My brother stayed there and milked cows on that farm until he retired and was still milking less than 50 cows, but made a good living there. But anyway, that's where I came from. But then I was fortunate enough to be able to go to the University of Missouri back in the days when someone of modest intelligence and very little economic means were able to work their way through college, which I did, working in the cafeterias, and was able to get my degree in agricultural economics. And I spent 3 years working with Wilson Packing Company, which was one of the largest meat packers in the country at that particular time, for the big change in meat packing. And then I decided I was going to go back to graduate school. Then I eventually got a PhD in agricultural economics at the University of Missouri in 1970. And I had a 30-year academic career then. But in the first half of that academic career, I was a very traditional agricultural economist. And that meant that I was teaching and preaching, if you want to put it that way, what I'd been taught, what I'd been preached to, that agriculture had to be a bottom line business, that idea of agriculture as a way of life was out of date and that sort of thing. You know, farm fence row to fence row, get bigger, get out. That was kind of the agricultural economics push that was that time. And I kind of bought into that because I thought, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to make good food affordable for everybody. And then I got into the 1980s and I began to question where we were going. I got into the farm financial crisis of the 1980s. And by that time, I had been a livestock marketing specialist, analyzing markets and forecasting prices. But at that time, I was able to go to the University of Georgia as the Extension Agricultural Economics Department head. So as the responsibility of people in our department to try to help people survive the farm financial crisis. For those of you old enough to remember it, that's still what I call it. And the fact is that farmers had done what we so-called experts was telling them. They got big rather than they get out. But a lot of them had borrowed a lot of money to get big, to buy land, to build buildings, equipment, and that sort of thing, at record high interest rates and inflation rates. And then we got into 1970s, the export markets dried up, the nation went into a recession, we had a global recession, exports dried up, and farmers were caught with huge debts at record high interest rates. They couldn't even make the interest payments. And so we were out working with these farmers, trying to help them figure out some way to save the farm, or at least talk them out of killing themselves, which many of them did at that time. And I came to the conclusion there was something fundamentally wrong with the kind of agriculture we'd been teaching, because we were expanding production faster than the market was growing consumers. And it meant for some to get big, others had to fail. And many of those farmers were failing. It wasn't any fault of their own. It was the fault of the system. And then I began to look around and say, this isn't working for farmers. It's not working for rural communities that depend upon those farmers. And then I realized it's not working for the land. We're polluting the land with agricultural chemicals and pesticides and eroding the soils. And so I switched careers really in mid-career. I shifted and said, when sustainable agriculture was just coming onto the horizon at that time, regenerative agriculture, as I talk about in my presentation, was part of that movement that led to the sustainable agriculture programs. So I spent the rest of my academic career and the time since I retired in 2000 talking about issues related to sustainability, particularly agriculture and economic sustainability. So that's a long period of time in a relatively short time frame.
Throughout that process, who would you consider a mentor to you?
A fellow by the name of Harold Breimar at the University of Missouri. When I got there, Harold had been with USDA for some time, and he was expert in policy and been in USDA when they were developing policy. But Harold never gave up on the concept of and the values of a traditional family farm. That farming as a way of life, as a social, an ecologically responsible way of life, is in addition to just a way to make a living. It had to be a way to make a living, but it also had to be a way to be a responsible member of the community and to take care of the land and pass the land on to the next generation, at least as good as it was passed to you. And these were the values of traditional family farms. Farmers didn't always live up to that, as we know, because we got the death toll and everything, but I think they were striving for that. And in many cases, they simply lacked the information or the know-how to do it, or perhaps, like I was, got misled into something. but I still believe in those values of the traditional family farm, and Harold stuck with that and continued to work even after he retired.
By the way, back to something you said, and probably 99% of our guests here are actually too young to even remember any of this, but
right.
People don't realize that the what was called a recession in the economy generally between 76, let's say, that time frame, and in the early 80s, let's say 83, 84, was really the biggest agricultural depression since the Depression, and in some cases was probably bigger. And I was living in South Dakota at that time on the eastern border, and the number, you talked about the suicides, the number of estates that, multi-generation, homestead, back from the 1840s, 1850s, that failed. And again, the number of families that were just destroyed. And again, it all grew out of moving from a diverse soil building, land loving mentality to a fence row to fence row, get big or die.
Right.
And that was the failing, which, by the way, I think is a good segue to let you move into your presentation.
Right. Very good.
And then if we have time for additional discussion afterwards, we'll do that.
Okay.
Everybody, please, again, while we're doing the presentation, we probably won't interrupt with questions, but why don't you go ahead and put your questions in, and then when John's done, we'll answer those. And Mark, prompt us for what those are after John's finished.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Let me get on to the presentation here. Okay.
Yep, you are in presentation mode.
But I'm on. I need to get on my my PowerPoint. So let me get back here.
Oh, you are. You're there. You're on probably the first slide.
I need to see my PowerPoint. That's.
Oh, you can't see it. Okay, you do need to get into that mode.
Click on that yellow button again. I think it will minimize it, and then you can see it.
Okay, where do I minimize it now?
What are you looking at right now? Go to webinar.
I'm seeing the two of us, me and Wayne's what I'm seeing on my screen right now.
Oh, okay. Just cross it out.
Okay.
Cross it out.
Now I see it. Now I see it. Thank you. All right. Okay, it's just sent me up something up in the corner, which is okay. It says you've hidden the webcam. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't even think the audience sees
Okay.
that.
All right, very good. Okay, let's start off. That's just my title slide there. I want to start off and I want to talk about sustainable regenerative agriculture. And I'm going to try to move through this in about 20, 25 minutes. And I'm going to cover a lot of territory, but I want to leave time for people to come back and ask questions about parts of it that want more clarification, or people disagree with me, that's fine. I always talking to a thing that I tell my truth. I say what I believe to be true, but as you heard before, I changed my mind some during my lifetime. So if somebody disagrees with me, that's okay. But regenerative agriculture has come back into popularity primarily right now because of the climate change issue and the potential for regenerative agriculture to address climate change. But it really has its roots in sustainability. In fact, it really goes back to kind of permanent agriculture for people like Sir Albert Hyde and Henry Hyde Bailey and various others talked about in the early 1900s about a permanent agriculture, regenerative agriculture. But regenerative agriculture was really championed by Robert Rodale of the Rodale Institute during the 1980s. He was talking about regenerative organic farming then, but he liked regenerative more than sustainable. But he was a part of that movement in USDA that put together a program that was initially called the Low Input Sustainable Program, Agriculture Program, or LISA program, but later evolved into the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, which was the first major step of USDA into dealing with sustainable agriculture. But regenerative agriculture was a part of that, and it's still a big part of the Rodale Institute. Rodale Institute's going back now and talking about regenerative organic based on those principles that Rodale talked about back in the 1980s. But sustainable agriculture, when I talk about sustainable regenerative agriculture, you always have to define what you mean by sustainable agriculture, because there's so many definitions out here and misinterpretations, which I think a lot of them are intentional. But I got the interpretation or definition that basically goes back to the Brundtland Report of 1987, where they defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of people of the future, current generation, but also provides opportunities for those of future generations to meet their needs as well. And I shortened that down and say sustainable agriculture is an agriculture that has the ability to meet the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. And I think most of us that take sustainability seriously know about the 3 dimensions of sustainability, but oftentimes you'll see 3 separate circles with some overlap in the middle. But in reality, we need to recognize that everything comes from nature, from the environment, and the society that we, the people, we're one species of many on this earth, and we're a part of nature and a part of the environment, and the economy is a creation of society to facilitate meeting the needs through impersonal relationships, and everything that's of any value to us, including everything of economic value, eventually comes from nature. It comes from the soil, the air, the water, energy, sunlight, those things of nature. And so we're inherently dependent upon that for regeneration. And every time we use something, some of the usefulness is used up, the basic second law of thermodynamics, which means that we have to continually regenerate and renew the usefulness of nature and society if we're going to be sustainable over the long run. But a sustainable regenerative agriculture also has to be resilient. It has to be able to withstand the shocks, and it has to be resourceful. It has to be able to meet the needs of people rather than just regenerate the soil. I think the renewed interest in regenerative agriculture now comes from the fact that agriculture, as we have it today, is a major contributor to climate change. Some people disagree about the specific amount. A lot of people say it's more than transportation. But agriculture, the industrial agriculture that I talk about, the large specialized operations of today, are a major source of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, other greenhouse gases from tillage of the soil, but also application high levels of nitrogen fertilizer goes back into the air, nitrogen oxide, carbon dioxide from the soil, but also methane, nitrous oxide, various other things from the large confinement animal feeding operations are also major contributors. A resilient agriculture, a regenerative agriculture can in fact reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon in the soil. And that's the reason for the interest in it. So if we talk about regenerative agriculture, again, there's a whole wide range of definitions out there, but I like the definition of Chesapeake Bay Foundation that I found online. And it says, in simple terms, regenerative agriculture is a holistic approach to agriculture that focuses on the interconnectedness of farming with the ecological system as a whole. I like that holistic kind of approach to regenerative agriculture. But it goes ahead and it lists the principles of regenerative agriculture, and this is pretty common. Most people that talk about regenerative agriculture will include some version of these basic principles that a regenerative agriculture minimizes soil disturbance, either no-till or minimum tillage systems, so you're not releasing the carbon from the soil boost tillage. Also, it talks about keeping the ground covered, keeping the soil covered so you're not having bare ground that's releasing the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And diversified cropping systems, where rather than having a monocropping system, you got a diversification of some grasslands, keep the grass covered and things of that nature with croplands and so on. And there's a big emphasis on keeping living roots in the soil at all times so you can maintain the biological health and the organisms in the soil have something to feed on. And integrating livestock into the farming operation so you can have pastures and have ground covers and you can have the diversity of farming operations as well. A sustainable regenerative agriculture, however, is more than just carbon sequestration. It's not about that. If we get into sustainability, we have to go beyond that. We have to recognize that this excessive tillage of farming fence row to fence row not only it's eroded and degraded the structural integrity and the biological health of the soil. It's not just about releasing carbon from the soil. It's about destroying the biological health and integrity of the soil. When we have the monocropping systems, the large confinement animal feeding operations, the over-application of manure and farming across the hillsides, and just the intensive farming operation, we're depleting the productivity of the soil and destroying soil health. But sustainable regenerative agriculture has to be about more than just the soil health. A lot of people I talk to, they just focus on soil health. A lot of the Rodale program right now is focused just on soil health as if that's the holdup. It's about more than that. Rural America has been polluted by agricultural chemicals and biological waste that I talked about earlier. We've got the cropping systems with high applications of nitrogen fertilizer, and we can talk about this, but the economic application of fertilization, or particular nitrogen, is always in excess of the agronomic and the ecological application. So we end up with pollution. The pesticides that pollute, again, the large confinement animal feeding operations, the over-application of manure, and then the large lagoons or various other means that pollute the air with the noxious chemicals that come from it. And a sustainable generation of regenerative agriculture is not just about what happens on the farm. It's about the performance of that system as a whole. And if we look at our industrial agri-food system of today, we see that the retail markets has been flooded with cheap junk food, as I talked about before. We were going to reduce the cost of food. I thought we were going to make good food affordable to everyone. We made food more affordable, at least through the 1970s to 1990s. But the food that we're producing today is producing profits for the corporation, but it's not providing nutrition to the people, whether it's the food deserts in the cities where people have no choices food other than the highly processed, unhealthy food, the high in fat and high in salt and various other things, or whether it's the junk foods that's in the fast food sector. Today, we spend about half of what we spend on food is spent for food away from home, and a big part of that is in fast food places where the food is clearly, most of the food is clearly unhealthy, and is having a negative impact, particularly on our children. A sustainable regenerative agriculture must also contribute to public health, protect public health. And today's system is not socially, what I call ecological, social, economically functional system today is a threat to public health. We have people, actually more people, a higher percentage of people that are classified as food insecure or hungry today than we had back in the 1960s before this last round of industrialization. In addition to that, we have an epidemic of obesity and heart disease and high blood pressure and a whole range of cancers and various other ailments that are associated with the so-called Western diet, which is basically the industrial agriculture, industrial corporate food system diet. We have kids that are dying from cancer and diabetes and a whole range of other things that wouldn't have happened in the future. And all of these are linked scientifically to the change in diet that's associated with the industrialization of agriculture and the food system. A sustainable regenerative agriculture must also contribute to social equity and justice. It's not just about ecological and economic. It's about the social justice of the issue, and the environmental and nutritional health risk that I've talked about of today is borne disproportionately by those people in low-income communities and socially and ethically marginalized people in the communities, whether it's in rural areas like this or whether it's in the urban areas or wherever it is. It's the people that cannot afford good food or cannot afford to protect themselves from the environmental risks that end up bearing the brunt of it. And this is particularly true in the case of CAFOs in the south, or large confinement animal feeding operations in the south and Delmarva that locate primarily in marginalized areas. Industrial agriculture, I know it's a strong indictment, but I feel very strongly about this. I've observed it over the years. I grew up in a vibrant rural community. I thought the prospects for the future of rural communities was good when I was growing up. We were going to do things that were going to make life better, and we've done exactly the opposite. Industrial agriculture has turned our rural communities into the new inner cities. A recent Wall Street Journal, I guess it's a couple of years old, journal report where they went back and did a survey and looked at a whole range of socioeconomic indicators: rural poverty, unemployment, early death, illness, disability, teen pregnancy, drug abuse, crimes. Rural communities rank below the inner cities in terms of all of these categories. My conclusion: the problems of industrial agriculture are simply too great to ignore, and regenerative agriculture is a response to that whole thing. It may be about climate change, but if it's going to be sustainable, we've got to respond to the whole problems of the system as a whole. I pointed out in other presentations and in my writings that we have two roads to the future that I see of agriculture and of the food system. The first road that's being promoted by what I call the agribusiness establishment, which includes large agribusiness corporations, but also the major commodity groups that are tied into this specialized, standardized consolidation of agriculture, and even some of the major farm organizations, such as the American Farm Bureau Corporation, that tied into this vision of the future of agriculture. It's this agro-corporate sustainability. I talked about all the definitions, but you can go on, and Monsanto and DuPont and Cargill, and all of them have, their sustainability program. Most of it's greenwashing. Some of it is, takes us in the general direction of sustainability and is probably better than what we're doing now anyway. But none of those pay any significant attention to the social and economic equity of agriculture that's associated with the things that I feel are important if we're going to have an agriculture that's sustainable, that meets the needs of people of the present, all the people of the present, and does it in a way that doesn't diminish opportunities for the future. They talk about sustainable farming, and they talk about high-tech, biotech, infotech, precision agriculture, climate-smart farming. That's the road to the future that's being promoted by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and all of the big agribusiness corporations as well. They move it to a kind of a system in which I feel that we'll end up with total corporate control of agriculture if we go in this direction. This precision agriculture that's guided by GPS systems, robots, big data is a term that you hear a lot about now, where the big corporations are collecting data on all the farms all across the country, not here, but in other places, so that they can program the machines to run the robots by GPS systems and make it work. And the people that are going to control that system are people that have the data and the people that develop the technologies that go with it. And we can see this happening already on the farms across the country. Even our research and education programs are focused on sustainable intensification. Our land-grant universities, Farm Bureau, World Bank, IMF, they're all pushing it. But there's another road to the future, and I think that's one I want you to consider. As I said, this is my truth. You may disagree with me on that, and that's fine. But the second road, I think, is regenerative, sustainable regenerative agriculture. And it's based on the principles of agroecology. I'll come back to in a minute. Regenerative farming in the U.S. tends to be defined in terms of farming practices as opposed to overall principles of whatever. When you talk about reduced tillage, conservation tillage, as I mentioned a while ago, no-till, reduced fertilizers, pesticides, cover crops, crop rotations, increased biological diversity, again, crop rotation, cover crop, livestock cropping operations, more grass-based management-intensive livestock. But none of these practices really exclude this industrial system of production that I've talked about before, that's been so degrading in terms of basically the agro-ecosystem health and society in general. What we need is regenerative, sustainable agriculture. Regenerative in the U.S., it pays little attention to the productivity, actually meeting the needs of people, including people that are hungry, and meeting the needs of being responsible members of community, and helping build strong rural areas and strong rural economies and strong rural societies, and contributing to the good of society as a whole, meeting the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. A regenerative international I think that takes a more inclusive report, a more sustainable approach to regenerative agriculture that includes the ecological, social, and rural economic. Regenerative International focuses on outcomes rather than the practices. They talk about, when we talk about farming practices, they say it should be farming practices that increase biological diversity and enrich soil biology and soil health, that systems that improve watersheds and enhance agroecosystem services, but also systems that increase yield and resilience to climate instability, so that you can feed people and you can continue to produce a supply product and be concerned about who's fed, and then greater health and vitality for farming and ranching communities. These are part of the outcomes that they're seeking with a regenerative, sustainable regenerative system. They recognize that different farms require different practices. There is no one set of best management practices for regeneration, and that you can implement the same principles of sustainability on farms, but you have to do it with different practices on different farms. And so they talk about progressive improvement in whole agroecosystems and holistic individual decisions that express the essence of each farm. They fit the system, fit the practices to a particular farm, a particular farming operation, a particular natural ecosystem, a particular community, and have just and reciprocal relationships among all stakeholders. That includes, not just the people on the farm or the people, but the people that buy your products, your customers, and the people that you buy supplies from, and the people that you do the banking with, and the people within the community that are affected by what you do and that affect what you do. That all has to be considered. And you continue to grow the involvement of individuals, farms, and communities to actualize their potential. It contributes to the well-being of society and the progress so that people can move forward and everybody can participate in creating a better life. It's based on the principles of agroecology. Agroecology has kind of been the scientific basis for sustainable agriculture, sustainable regenerative agriculture. Since the inception back in the 80s and 90s, again, agroecology was one of the competitors with sustainability to come on the scene. Agroecology applies the science of ecology to agriculture. And the first principle in ecology is everything interconnected with everything else. So when we apply that to farming, it means that the plants, the soils, the animals, the families, the farmers, the communities, they're all interconnected. They're part of the same thing. You can't do one thing without affecting everything else. And that each agroecosystem is unique. As I said, there's no one set of best management practices. You have to fit what you do to the particular farm, the particular family, the particular community. And the principles of regenerative farming are the same. You just have different practices wherever you go when you follow agroecology. All farms are interconnected with communities and each affects the other's success. There's been a lot of research done, particularly international, on agroecology. One of my favorite studies come out in 2016. It was an international panel of experts that included a couple of top experts from the United States and universities that I have a lot of respect for. A group of about 20-some people, 24, 25 people from all around the world. In this study, they have 350 different scientific citations that they use in arriving at the conclusions. And among their basic conclusions was, and now read this, you go through it, but it says today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food for global markets, but are generating negative outcomes on multiple fronts, as I've talked about. Widespread degradation of land, water, and ecosystems, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity losses, persistent hunger, and micronutrient deficiency alongside a rapid rise in obesity and diet-related diseases, and livelihood stresses for farmers around the world, going back to the financial crisis of the 1980s. The report concluded and said, what is required is a fundamentally different model of agriculture based on diversified farm and farming landscapes, replacing chemical inputs, optimizing biodiversity, and stimulating interactions between different species as part of a holistic strategy to build long-term fertility, healthy agroecosystems, and secure livelihoods. Data shows that these farms can compete with industrial agriculture in terms of total output, performing particularly strongly under environmental stress and delivering production increases in places where additional food is desperately needed in those parts of the world where hunger is even greater. Diversified agroecosystems can also pave the way for diverse diets and improved health. It's not a lack of scientific evidence, as they said in the report, but you can read reams of it. It's not a lack of scientific evidence that's holding back this agroecology alternative or a shift for the future. It's the governance of the system. It's the government programs and the priority. If this industrial system of agriculture today is highly efficient, but it particularly not only lacks regenerative capacity, it lacks resilience, as we saw during the pandemic. And without those government programs, this industrial system simply couldn't be sustained economically. So we must change the way we set political priorities, is what they said. So I'll conclude here by talking about some policy alternatives. If we look ahead to the 2023 Farm Bill is coming up, my suggestion or my take on it is there will be relatively little change from past high-tech farming. They will, I think, address climate change, at least in verbiage. I think that crop insurance and disaster payments may actually be increased to offset the weather variability. Rather than changing the system, we simply ask the taxpayers to pony up more to offset the increased risk associated with climate change and weather variability. I think there may be increased funding for programs like the Environmental Quality Enhancement Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. And they may be targeted specifically to carbon sequestering practices that will be associated with that. I think that reduced tillage cover crops, managed grazing, those things in the regenerative system are probably going to qualify for carbon payments or special payments under the CSP program. And there's really talk of possible carbon trading, but I think that's probably a ways off. And we can talk more about carbon trading later, but I think everything about it says that it's only going to be the big farming operations that are going to benefit from that. The big farming operations are going to be set up to certify that they're testing water and monitoring carbon sequestration so they can be involved in carbon trading programs. So I think if we look beyond the 2023 Farm Bill, we need to start talking about these things now, but I think there is a possibility to change it. And one of the things I want to point out, we talked earlier about being old, is one of the advantages of being old is you can remember when things aren't like they were today. And I remember when there was a major shift in farm policy in the 1960s, and it was really, really apparent by the 1970s. And up to that point, farm policy basically was supporting independent family farms as a way of providing food security and taking care of the land. The conservation programs, everything was tied to sustaining independent family farms. And so that's what we had. We had a shift in policy then. The technologies made it possible, but that shift in policy made it inevitable. And another shift in policy could make it inevitable that we move toward a different future of a regenerative, sustainable regenerative agriculture for the future. The program that I was involved in, helping a group, mostly young people, put together on this was Regenerative Farming, the Green New Deal. It's on the internet. I'll put a link on this and give it to the organizers of the conference if you're interested in looking at it. And what's proposed in here is a transition of government programs from the industrial kind of commodity program approach that support regenerative whole farm systems. The focus on whole farm systems, not specifically commodities, but focused on whole farm systems. It proposes a program here of taking commodity-based insurance programs today and transforming them onto whole farm net revenue insurance, rather than insuring particular commodities, which leads to these highly specialized industrial systems. What you do is insure overall farm revenue. This is consistent with the initial Farm Bill. 1933, 1938 Farm Bills both had in it, when they defined the concept of parity, it was basically saying we're going to establish prices for agricultural commodities that ensure that farm family income is on par with non-farm family incomes. And what we could do in here is that we could ensure for those people that want to transition from conventional industrial commodity production to regenerative, sustainable regenerative systems, that we ensure their family income during that transition period. Or new people that want to get started in farming. There's a lot of young people that really want to get started, but they don't have the opportunity and they certainly can't take the risk. And we need programs that will help them come in. So during that transition period, until they're getting to the point where those regenerative farming operations are sufficiently profitable to be competitive with non-farm incomes, then we'd simply insure that much as we insure industrial agriculture today. We need to quit insuring the risk of industrial agriculture and begin insuring the risk of something that will take us in the direction we want to go. We can redirect public research and education to helping farmers develop sustainable regenerative programs rather than continuing to promote the sustainable intensive industrial future for agriculture. So that's my story. I thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll leave the rest of the time that we have now for questions and comments. If you want to take the screen back, well, that'd be fine at this point.
John, that was just incredible. Thank you so much. I'm going to rely on Mark and Reeb to help us with questions. Frankly, for whatever reason, my screen today, Mark doesn't show any of the questions. But anyway, do we have any questions yet, Mark or Reeb?
Yes, we do have. This one is from Ben Adams. He says, "Our CFO, can they be sustainable? They are not going away. They just bought out a smaller dairy operation 1 hour away. Economies of scale reign."
Okay, I can respond to that. And if I understand the question, you're talking about CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations, which are these large scale, sometimes people call them factory farms. And in my opinion, can you see me? I can't see me or anybody else on the screen. That's okay.
Yeah, we see both your first page of the website as well as you and I on the webcam.
Yeah, only you cannot see it because you crossed it out. So no worries.
Okay. All right. So I'll just talk into the camera then. But anyway, on the issue of the CAPOs, the sustainability of CAPOs, I argue that that's inherently an unsustainable kind of system. And the things that we're doing now, or that we're talking about doing now, is not going to make that system sustainable as we go into the future. There is a movement already to try to have a nationwide moratorium on CAPOs. There's a bill introduced by Senator Booker, and 2 or 3 times it's been introduced, that has co-sponsors and supporters that would basically phase out these large-scale confinement animal feeding operations. The basic problem with large-scale confinement animal feeding operations is they concentrate too much waste in the same space. When you have the same number of animals that were scattered out across the landscape, and particularly on farms where you grew the feed on the same farms where you fed the livestock and spread the manure back onto the fields, then you had an environmentally sound regenerative farming system, and that's what we need to move toward. But I empathize with the people that are tied into the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations. I know a lot of people say that they aren't going to go away. But I think if you have a shift in public opinion, and I think it's becoming pretty strong, then in fact, over time, they will go away. In fact, climate change now is fueling a major sort of global movement, really, but a very strong movement in this country that's painting all of animal agriculture with this same brush of being not only a threat to climate change, but a threat to human health. And they're tying together people that are concerned about animal welfare, about human health associated with fats and eating animal products, with the contribution, particularly of beef, to climate change and so on, and saying, okay, the simple thing you can do is quit eating meat and quit buying meat and things of this nature. And I think we run the risk of putting the whole of animal agriculture in place by simply accepting that CAPOs are going to be here, because the problem is associated with the large confinement animal feeding operations and the concentration of waste in places where you can't get it back to the land where the crops are grown so that you can have a truly regenerative farming system. And now they're talking about, bringing in methane generating systems and putting them on these farms. Well, what you're going to end up doing when you go to the methane generation and say, okay, we're going to capture the methane from those farming operations and burn it, well, you're releasing the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere from the methane. It's not as potent a greenhouse gas as the methane was, but in conjunction with that, you're also increasing the amount of nitrous oxide through the anaerobic digestive process that takes place, and that gets spread back on the fields again. It's sort of a washout in that case. And then on the side of providing opportunities for people to make a decent living on the farm, what you've done with this methane generator, it's a very sophisticated kind of system to make these systems work. You need people that really understand how the system works, and it requires a large upfront outlay of capital. I don't know of any of them that's been built without heavy government subsidies. But what that means is you're going to go to even larger operations that are going to concentrate larger amounts of waste, and you're going to end up with even more problems than we have today. So I feel very strongly about this, but I think this is probably the epitome of an unsustainable industrial system that eventually is going to have to go away if we're going to salvage animal agriculture of any kind. We need to realize those people in animal agriculture that are involved in CAPOs, and the vast majority of them aren't, that the CAPOs are putting their future in animal agriculture at risk.
Okay.
Great answer, John. What else do you have there, Reed?
Yes, I have a couple of those. Next one is from Tony Hill. He says, what, if any, changes do you see at a micro or macroeconomic level from a shift to regenerative agriculture, as you are suggesting? Tony Hill from Australia.
Yeah, I think the place to start, and the place that I've talked about and have written about, is at the local level. Everything I read about sustainability, regardless of whether I'm talking about sustainable agriculture or sustainability in general, sustainable society, sustainable economy, the people that I respect, the real thoughtful people that have done research on this and everything, always go back to the concept of relocalization. So if you think about changing policies right now in the U.S., I don't know how it is in Australia, you look at this and you say the policy changes I'm talking about would be impossible to make at the state level and federal level, because the political and economic power of what identifies as agricultural establishment is too strong. They basically dictate the policy process. But if you start at the local community level, and that's where we need to begin to reconnect people, farmers with their farms and farms with communities and communities with their farmers and so on. If we start at that level and say, okay, what can we do there? One of the ideas I've been promoting is that of a community food utility. I say, let's use the concept of a public utility, which is already legal in the US and it's already laws. We use public utilities for sewers and electricity and natural gas and the whole range of other things, public transportation and various things. We use the public utility to serve the public interest. We say these are essential for public interest, and therefore we set them up as a public utility. And basically it gives the people within that utility kind of the protection from the market economy, so they can do things that are in the public interest, regardless of whether or not they make economic sense or the more profitable things to do, and the taxpayers make up any slack in the difference. So if we could do that at the local level, it's public utility, rural electric cooperatives that brought electricity to our place. It didn't make any economic sense to run those light lines 2 or 3 miles down the road for the 2 or 3 people down that didn't have anything to hook up except maybe a refrigerator and a toaster and a few light bulbs. But anyway, so you put the public utilities in. If you have those, and you put those in the local community, then the local community can say, we're going to focus on making sure that everybody in our community has enough food, that there aren't any hungry children. And that would qualify these communities then to take the government food assistance programs that are already being allocated and allow people to have their food assistance funds go through the community food utility. And the community food utility could ensure that you get a healthy diet and an adequate diet, and could source the maximum amount of food that they could get from local farmers who agree to produce foods in regenerative, sustainable, healthy foods from healthy soils in a regenerative, sustainable way, and support local processing, local distribution systems. And then you could build on the policies that we have, and then that could spread from community to community, and then you begin to have the power to change state policies and federal policies that begin to support this different kind of agriculture that respects the basic principles of agroecology I talked about, of fitting farms to particular locations, particular communities, and then allowing the federal government then to distribute funds for the good, because these things basically serve the good of the overall society and not just the individual communities. So I think that's the direction we need to go, is focus on making change at the local level where we can do it, and then growing that into changes in state and federal policy.
Awesome. Marie, what else?
Okay, this next one is from Mary Ellen Miller, and she asked, here in Iowa, we are facing 3 pipeline proposals to move CO2 from ethanol and fertilizers plants to underground sequestration sites in the Dakotas and Illinois. It has been suggested that even we are not successful in stopping these pipelines, which seriously degrades the soil, by the time they are in place, the move away from fossil fuels will quickly make them obsolete. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's another one of those things that cause people to lose confidence in government when you see programs like this go into place and be supported by government and things of this nature. First of all, I think, most people, I don't know about most people, but I was bought into ethanol, but I think it's very marginally in benefit from ethanol. And I think it certainly has done more to continue to promote industrial agriculture than about anything I know of in the state of Iowa. So, but I won't go into that part of it. Let's stick with the pipelines part of it, of going the CO2. What they're proposing to do is spend billions of dollars on these pipelines that would take from the ethanol plants in Iowa and other places, probably Illinois as well, and take it out to North Dakota somewhere. And I was just reading today where they say, okay, we're going to put it in the ground and we're going to pay you, I think it was, I don't remember, $24 or something like that a ton if you put it in the ground and keep it in a cavern of some sort, but we'll pay you 75–80% of that, maybe $20 a ton, if you use it then in a fracking operation to shoot it into the ground so you can bring up more natural gas and oil. So you're basically sequestering carbon, which is probably going to be used to to release more natural gas and oil, which you're going to burn, and you're putting carbon right back into the atmosphere. Any carbon that you take out by sequestering it at these ethanol plants and putting it in the ground, you're probably going to offset it by what you release from the fossil energy that's put out. We need to recognize that there are natural kind of carbon cycles, and if we put this carbon back into the soil where it'll be useful in the future in terms of producing food, we may need that carbon at some time in the future. And if we bury it in the soil in places where we can't get to it, we may find out that we bury too much of it at one time. But anyway, I just think it's another situation where you see people that are taking advantage of the public interest in climate change and carbon sequestration, and they're figuring out how can we make a lot of money on this, doing something that we and our friends know how to do, rather than actually addressing the systemic problems that the problems are in agriculture, is with the industrial system of agriculture in general. We need to change that, and also in our unsustainable economy, and we need to change that. It's just a way of putting off the inevitable necessity to change. I like to tell people, sustainability is not just a buzzword that goes around. Sustainability says, can we continue doing what we've been doing? And I think anybody that looks objectively at that has to come to the conclusion that we can't. We simply cannot continue to have endless economic growth. We simply cannot continue to exploit and extract from the soil in society to produce fuel for our automobiles, or to produce to put carbon back in the ground, or whatever else we want to do with it. That it's not sustainable, and ultimately it has to be changed.
Okay, Arif, what else?
Okay, this one is from Dean, and he says, are you familiar with Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems trial?
I'm familiar with the Center for Integrated Cropping Systems at the University of Wisconsin. Was there a question other than that? Yes, I'm familiar with them. I'm supportive of the work that they've done. I don't know about specific programs they might have right now, but I've been generally supportive of the people and the programs that they've supported there. I'm particularly supportive of a grazing program now at the University of Wisconsin being funded out of USDA that's trying to promote the concept of a grass-based grazing systems in dairy operations as a replacement for the dairy CAFO. So I do know something about that system, and I'm very supportive of that.
Okay, this one is from Tony again, and he says, are you familiar with holistic management as developed by Alan Savory? How do you think it relates to your concept of regenerative agriculture?
I think it is very close to it. It has many of the dimensions. I am familiar with it going back to the 1980s, and I've met Alan Savory. I've even spoken at his annual conference in New Mexico at one time. But anyway, I think it comes as close as anything I've seen out there in terms of this holistic approach. And if you talk about Savory's or holistic management, you talk about the three-part goal. It's basically an ecological, social, and economic goal. It talks about future landscapes. That's the ecological goal, the kind of quality of life. I guess that's what they call it now. That's kind of the social goal. And then there's the means of production, which is the economic goal. And they talk about a holistic approach where you develop a system in harmony with the nature, with the cycles, the energy cycles, water cycles, things of that nature. And it's a systemic way of making decisions that I think leads you to sustainability. I know Alan Savory was reluctant to call it approach to sustainability, but I think, a lot of that is if you're out here making your living on a particular approach where it's holistic resource management or regenerative agriculture, whatever it is, you've got to kind of talk about how yours is different from the others in order to keep it going. But I've always talked about holistic resource management as a logical approach to managing sustainably. I've talked to a lot of people. I think Savory's done a lot of good. I've talked to a lot of people that adopted holistic resource management, but everyone that I've talked to, basically, after they went through the initial course and managed for a while, they changed the system to fit their particular farm and fit them personally, which I think is a logical approach to continue to evolve it. But it's a good place to start. A lot of people need sort of a systemic step-by-step approach rather than sort of the more general thing that I've talked about here today. So I recommend to people that you buy into a particular approach, if that's the way you feel, whether it's holistic management, whether it's regenerative farming, or whether it's organic farming, or whatever it is, that it takes to get you started and to give you some steps to get moving in that direction. And then you sense over time, how is this going in terms of meeting the overall objectives of a desirable quality of life, good relationships within communities, a good relationship with the earth? Am I being a responsible steward of the land? And am I able to make a living doing that? And if you're focusing on those directions and how all those fit together, you're moving toward a sustainable system.
Reed, before we go on with more questions, about how many more do you have there?
I have one more.
Let's do that one.
I can do it real quick. I'll do it real quick. Okay.
Yeah.
Do that.
So this one is.
Go ahead and do that question, and then I've got a couple of comments, and then we want to let John finish with just some last thoughts on things that he'd like to impart for us.
Yes. So this last one is from Miller and says that I've often heard that the Farm Bill only survives because it was tied to food stamps, the program to feed low-income families. The Farm Bill is only moved forward by a continuing resolution because if it had to stand as a separate appropriation bill, it would not survive. Thoughts?
Well, I've heard that argument, and I think there's probably some logic to it. What I've argued for is that we need to have a Department of Domestic Food Security that includes the part of agriculture that's really about feeding people and not about fuel and not about exports and various other things, and bring that into it. But the food security has always been kind of the justification for the Farm Bill, even going back. The first Farm Bill, I was just doing some research for a paper that I'm on, but the first Farm Bill was 1933, but it was declared unconstitutional. But the Farm Bill of 1938, in terms of implementing that, like in 39, they actually had the first food stamps. They were oriented toward agricultural surpluses, but it's always been a part of the Farm Bill. And I think it makes sense to keep agriculture focused on providing community food security, or providing food security, meaning feeding hungry people. We're not doing that now, but I think it makes sense to keep that part of agriculture together with food security issues. But I don't argue with the point. I wouldn't argue with the point if you took food stamps out, that agriculture is not big enough as a purely economic component, the way it's managed now, to justify a separate department.
Okay. Well, I'm going to make a quick anecdotal comment, and then let John finish with some thoughts. First, the anecdote starts with the reality is that, John, as we get to know each other better, and I really hope we do, I think we're going to see we have very lockstep views on very many things. Now, a little bit like you, I won't say that I've had some of those views for my entire career as it relates to agriculture, which I'm a city boy growing up, but as soon as I finished graduate school, ever since then, I've lived on a farm to where I have made a living from that farm. And those farms have ranged from as small as 7 acres to the largest one that I'm on, which is right now, which is where we own about 45 acres, but we lease or control or manage about another 1,000 acres. And it's all regenerative. This place that I'm at now, 15 years ago, was an overgrazed cattle field, literally to where you couldn't see any evidence of vegetation after about August 1st. So I live in the arid Mountain West, where we don't get anything more than about 13 inches of moisture in a year. Most of it comes as snow in the winter. So by the time you get to the end of a growing season, the moisture's been taken out of the soil if it's been improperly managed. Well, today you'd have no idea. Today you'd think you were in the savannas of Africa if you saw what this particular area looked like. But here's the little anecdote. You showed early on, the very first slide even, Bob Rodale. I was very fortunate in that late 70s, early 80s time frame to meet Bob. Had a little bit of involvement with the start of Rodale, but it was mainly through a guy who was his best friend. And the two of them were just wild. They knew how to party, they knew how to just have fun, and yet were unbelievably dedicated to regenerative types of practices. And this guy was Jonathan Todd. And Jonathan Todd became a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and actually retired there and was an emeritus. As you know, both Jonathan and Bob, and probably don't know this, but Jonathan have both died. Well, anyway, Jonathan's an aquatic ecologist, which is what I am. My education background is in watershed management and then managing aquatic systems in concert with terrestrial systems to also generate some food gain from those aquatic systems. So that was a very crazy sort of mentality 50 years ago. It's still crazy today. But Jonathan and I would be in Bob's ear all the time. Bob was the fundraiser, was really very good at that. And anyway, we had some just great times. And just a little bit of an anecdotal story there. And from that, I have, and you talked about local farming, which is what I'm probably the strongest believer in, local farm communities. On this acreage that I have over 40 different farming activities at any given time. And there's some principles about this that I won't go into details on, but like any kinds of business situation, by the way, we call our farm an ecological business park. And the reality is these 40 different ventures at any given year, just like businesses in any area, 70 to 80% of them are going to fail. About 10% of them are going to be marginal, and then about 10% are going to be rock stars. And you can never predict which are going to be those. It has a lot to do with the persistence and the concern and the care of the principals that are doing the business, but it also has to do with luck and maybe more importantly with the community. And the fact that no one's farming in a vacuum. Everybody's system affects someone else's, because this isn't a big enough area that they can't. And so 2 years ago at our peak, we had 1,500 laying hens that were completely open range. That's about 1,000 more than we should have had. We were over capacity. We've actually since then gone back down to a much more manageable number. But over a 5-year period, you wouldn't have believed the number of ancillary farming activities that came out of that, primarily the chicken-dominated circumstance. And it had to do with, again, manure production, composted manure. It had to do with, again, improved soil health to where we could actually scrape soil that had gotten very rich in soil nutrients, move it somewhere else and do something other value with it, to a market farm that never could have grown here before, producing about 80 different varieties of different edibles, vegetables and greens and others for our local community, to a rabbit operation that, again, probably would have never thought about, to a turkey business on a smaller level, to integration with the natural organisms of the area. Deer, our deer population, we took up in levels pretty dramatically. And then we took advantage of hunting regulations and harvested as many as we could legally by law. And we kept that population growing and sustained, regenerative over a 15-year period now. So one day we'll talk in a lot more detail about that, John.
Yeah.
But,
That's very good.
example at a small level.
Yeah. I noticed that on the screen is my book, Small Farms are Real Farms. A lot of people ask me sometimes, well, is regenerative sustainable agriculture associated with farm size? Well, I say regenerative farming operations are management intensive, and what you described is a management intensive sort of farming operation, and it has the dimensions of ecological, social, economic, as you've described in that. There's some areas of the country where big farms can be managed sustainably with less management. It requires less intensive management for a large cattle operation, for example, primarily cattle operation, than it does for a small vegetable operation where you have a CSA or something growing a whole diversity of crops that have to come out every week or so. So the sustainability of the farming operation, it depends upon the ability of the farmer to know that particular farm, to know the land, to know what it can do here, to know the community that they're farming in, to farm in harmony with that. And that's what makes a farm sustainable. And some people can manage big farms very sustainably. I have friends that manage very complex, sustainable operations or moving in the direction of sustainability in larger operations. But it's not the size of the farm, it's the way that it's managed and managed intensively. And you can have a very small farm that's a real farm in the sense that it's managed for ecological, social, economic purposes. It's a way to make a living, but it's also a socially and ecologically responsible way of life. So I would just close out my part of it with saying, to me, what's important is finding what you think you're put here on earth to do. Farming is difficult. I tell people it's one of the most intellectually, physically, emotionally demanding occupations that I can think of would be farming. And I tell people, don't farm unless that's what you feel you're put here on earth to do, because it's simply too hard to do it responsibly, to do it sustainably. But if that's what you're put here to do, if that's what you feel in your heart is your purpose, then do it, because that's the only thing that's going to make you happy. And that's what I say for people in general. That's what I try to do myself. I believe that we're each here for a unique purpose, that there's something that we're meant to do, that it's not something that we accomplish, but it's kind of a path that we're meant to walk. And if we can sense our purpose, and if we can walk that path as closely as we can, we all get lost from time to time, but if we can walk that path, then we will have made the greatest contribution that we possibly could have made to the greater good of humanity and of the universe, and we will have lived the best possible life that we could have lived. So regardless of how important or unimportant anybody else thinks it is, if you find your purpose and have the courage and have the ability to live it, then I think you've done all that you possibly could do to contribute to sustainability, regenerative capacity, all of the things that contribute to the greater goodness of society and of the earth.
All right. Well, that's a great way to finish off. I know that as our replay comes out on this, there are a number of places on the presentation that John did where it shows how to get in touch with him. If you have further questions or you'd like to help in some of the things that he's doing, I'm sure he'd never turn that down.
Right.
And John, thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure. Areeb, thank you for your work. As always, Mark, thank you. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and take it on out.
All right, I'm gone. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.